Young black boy helps female millionaire with faulty car. What happened next changed his life forever. The crowd had gathered quickly, eyes narrowing and voices rising with anger and suspicion. Caleb stood frozen, his palms sweaty as he faced the circle of strangers. They all stared at him. A young black boy holding the heavy wrench that had just loosened the bolts of a flat tire on the sleek, expensive car. Beside him, Mrs. Evelyn Montgomery, the woman he'd been helping, clutched her designer bag tightly, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously between Caleb and the furious mob. "Did you touch her car without permission?" A man barked, stepping closer to Caleb. Caleb opened his mouth to explain, but his words were drowned out by another voice, sharper and angrier. "I bet he was trying to steal something." The accusations flew faster now, fueled by assumptions that didn't wait for answers. Caleb's chest tightened as he glanced at Mrs. Montgomery, silently pleading for her to say something. But she just stared, her expression unreadable. And then, just as Caleb thought he couldn't take it anymore, something happened that changed everything. 2 hours earlier, Caleb had been sitting on the curb outside his grandmother's small house, tossing a warm baseball between his hands. It was another quiet afternoon in Greenville, a sleepy town where not much ever happened. Caleb's summer days were usually spent dodging his grandmother's nagging about chores and dreaming of the big leagues. He wanted to be a professional baseball player, and nothing, at least in his mind, was more important than perfecting his pitch. Across the street, he saw the shiny black car before he saw the driver. It was the kind of car Caleb had only seen in movies, all curves and gloss, with rims that sparkled under the sunlight. When it slowed to a stop just a few feet away, he couldn't help but stare. The driver stepped out, a woman in her 40s wearing a tailored suit and heels that clicked against the pavement. She looked important, like someone who didn't belong in a neighborhood like his. Caleb guessed she was lost. But as she walked around to the front of the car, her face twisted in frustration. She crouched by the front tire, inspecting it before pulling out her phone. Caleb couldn't hear her conversation, but he could tell by the way she threw her hands up that things weren't going well. He thought about going back inside. His grandma always said to stay out of other people's business. But something about the way the woman paced back and forth made Caleb hesitate. Finally, he crossed the street. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice polite. "Do you need help?" The woman looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up. Caleb noticed the way she clutched her purse tighter. "I'm fine," she said briskly. "Just a flat tire. I've called for assistance." Caleb nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fine at all. He glanced at the flat tire and then back at her. "I can fix that for you if you want," he offered. She hesitated, biting her lip. "Do you know how?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, straightening up. His older cousin had shown him how to change a tire last summer. It wasn't rocket science. After another moment of hesitation, she sighed. "All right, but be careful." Caleb grinned, relieved. He ran back to his grandma's house to grab her toolkit, returning in minutes. As he worked, the woman watched him closely, her arms crossed and her phone clutched tightly in one hand. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. "Caleb, ma'am." "Caleb what?" "Caleb Jones." She nodded, filing the information away. "I'm Mrs. Montgomery." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure she felt the same way. It took him less than 15 minutes to change the tire. When he was done, he stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There you go," he said, smiling. Mrs. Montgomery inspected the car, nodding slowly. "Good job," she said. Then, after a pause, she reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. "Here." Caleb's eyes widened. $50 was more than he'd ever earned at once. But before he could take it, something happened that neither of them expected. A man stepped out of the nearby convenience store, followed by 2 more people, all of them staring at Caleb and Mrs. Montgomery. The first man, tall and stocky, pointed directly at Caleb. "Hey," he shouted. "What's going on here?" Within moments, more people had gathered, their curious gazes quickly turning suspicious. The tension thickened as questions and accusations started flying. Did you touch her car? What's a kid like you doing with a car like that? That he was trying to steal something. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to Mrs. Montgomery, hoping she would step in and clear things up. But she just stood there, clutching her purse and looking unsure. Say something, Caleb fought desperately, but the words never came. Instead, the crowd closed in tighter, their voices rising with anger. Caleb felt trapped, like he couldn't breathe. He clutched the wrench in his hand, his fingers trembling. And that's when Mrs. Montgomery finally spoke. What she said shocked everyone. Her voice cut through the noise like a knife. Stop it. He wasn't stealing. The crowd hesitated, their muttering turning to uneasy silence. Mrs. Montgomery stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. This boy, she said, motioning to Caleb, was helping me. I had a flat tire, and he offered to fix it. That's all. Her words hung in the air, but the skeptical expressions remained. A woman near the front crossed her arms. Then why were you clutching your purse like that? Mrs. Montgomery blinked, as though caught off guard. Caleb noticed her hand still gripping the strap of her designer bag. She let it fall to her side, looking faintly embarrassed. I wasn't thinking about that, she said quickly. But he didn't do anything wrong. The man who had started the commotion frowned, his eyes darting between Caleb and Mrs. Montgomery. You sure about that? Kids like him can be sneaky. Mrs. Montgomery's face hardened. What do you mean, kids like him? The man raised his hands defensively. Hey, I'm just saying it's not every day you see. He trailed off, realizing he was digging himself into a hole. The tension was unbearable. Caleb shifted on his feet, his gaze fixed on the ground. He wished he could disappear. Mrs. Montgomery straightened her shoulders. This is ridiculous, she said firmly. He did me a favor, and I offered him money for his help. That's the truth. Some in the crowd murmured in agreement, but others still looked unconvinced. One older man shook his head. Doesn't look right to me, he muttered. At that moment, another voice joined the fray. What's going on here? Everyone turned to see Officer Bradley, the local police officer, stepping out of his patrol car. He was well known around town, usually the one called in to settle disputes or handle minor infractions. The man who had accused Caleb wasted no time explaining. This kid was messing with her car. We think he was trying to steal something. That's not true, Mrs. Montgomery said firmly. I've already explained he was helping me change a flat tire. Officer Bradley looked between the two of them, his face unreadable. All right, let's all calm down, he said, holding up a hand. He turned to Caleb. Is that true, son? Caleb nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I just wanted to help. Bradley studied him for a moment, then glanced at Mrs. Montgomery. You confirm this? Yes, she said, her voice steady. The officer nodded. All right, then. If there's no crime here, I suggest everyone move along. The crowd grumbled but began to disperse, some casting lingering glances at Caleb as they walked away. When they were finally alone, Mrs. Montgomery turned to Caleb, her face softening. I'm sorry about that, she said quietly. People can be ignorant. Caleb shrugged, though his hands were still shaking. It's not your fault, ma'am. She hesitated, then reached into her purse again. Here, she said, holding out the $50 bill. Caleb hesitated. After everything that had just happened, taking the money felt strange, but he knew his grandmother would want him to. Slowly he took it. Thank you. Mrs. Montgomery smiled faintly. Thank you for helping me, she said. She turned to get back in her car, but just as she opened the door, she paused. Caleb, she said, glancing over her shoulder, do you always help people like this? He blinked at the question. I guess so. My grandma says we should help when we can. Her smile widened, though there was something thoughtful in her expression. That's a good thing, she said. Then she got in her car and drove away. Caleb watched until the taillights disappeared down the street. He clutched the $50 bill tightly in his hand, unsure what to make of the entire ordeal. He didn't know it yet, but that day was just the beginning. What Mrs. Montgomery did next would change his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. As Caleb walked back home, he had no idea that his small act of kindness was already setting events in motion. Events that would bring out the best and worst in the people around him. And soon he'd find himself in the middle of something much bigger than just a flat tire. The next morning, Caleb woke up to the smell of bacon sizzling in the kitchen. His grandmother was humming an old gospel tune, her voice warm and comforting. For a moment, everything felt normal. He stretched and stared at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the day before. But as he got dressed, he couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Montgomery and the crowd that had accused him. The $50 bill was still on his nightstand, a constant reminder of how quickly things had spiraled. "Caleb," his grandma called from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready." He stuffed the bill into his pocket and headed downstairs. His grandma, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, placed a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and toast in front of him. "Eat up," she said, sitting down across from him. "You've got yard work to do today." Caleb groaned. "Come on, Grandma. It's summer." She raised an eyebrow. "And those weeds ain't gonna pull themselves." He rolled his eyes but dug into his breakfast. As he ate, he wondered if he should tell her about what had happened. But before he could decide, there was a knock at the door. His grandma frowned. Who could that be this early? She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. Caleb heard the door creak open, followed by a voice he recognized immediately. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Evelyn Montgomery. Is Caleb home?" Caleb merely choked on his toast. He jumped up and peeked around the corner. Sure enough, there was Mrs. Montgomery, standing on their porch in another sharp suit. Her car, gleaming as always, was parked at the curb. His grandma glanced back at him, her eyebrows raised. "You know this lady?" Caleb nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I helped her with her car yesterday." Mrs. Montgomery smiled. "He was a real lifesaver. I wanted to thank him properly." His grandma gave her a skeptical look but stepped aside. "Come on in," she said, motioning to the small living room. Mrs. Montgomery entered, looking slightly out of place among the faded furniture and crocheted doilies. She turned to Caleb. "Good morning, Caleb," she said warmly. "How are you today?" "I'm good," he said, feeling self-conscious under her gaze. She nodded. "Good. Listen, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I realized I owe you more than just money." Caleb blinked. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. I was just trying to help." Her smile widened. "That's exactly why I'm here. You see, I've spent most of my life working hard to get where I am, and I know how rare it is to meet someone as kind and selfless as you." Caleb wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded. Mrs. Montgomery glanced at his grandma, then back at him. "I want to do something for you, Caleb. Something that might make a real difference in your life." His grandma crossed her arms, her expression cautious. "What kind of something are we talking about?" Mrs. Montgomery hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I run a mentorship program for young people, helping them build skills and find opportunities they might not have otherwise. I'd like Caleb to join." Caleb's grandma narrowed her eyes. "Why would you want to help him? No offense, but people like you don't usually come around here offering charity." Mrs. Montgomery met her gaze evenly. "Because I see potential in him, and because I know what it's like to be underestimated." The room fell silent. Caleb's heart was racing. He couldn't tell if this was the best thing that had ever happened to him or just another situation that would end badly. Finally, his grandma sighed. "If Caleb wants to do it, I won't stand in the way. But you better mean what you say." Mrs. Montgomery nodded. "I do." She turned to Caleb, her expression earnest. "What do you say, Caleb? Are you willing to give it a shot?" Caleb hesitated, glancing at his grandma. She gave him a small nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll do it," Caleb said finally, his voice steady. Mrs. Montgomery beamed. "Excellent. We'll start tomorrow. I'll pick you up at 9." With that, she handed him a business card, said her goodbyes, and left. After she was gone, Caleb's grandma sat down heavily in her chair. "I don't know about this, Caleb," she said quietly. "Just be careful, okay?" "I will, Grandma." He said, though he wasn't sure what he needed to be careful about. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Caleb couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Montgomery had said. What kind of opportunities was she talking about? And why did she care so much about him? The next morning, Mrs. Montgomery arrived promptly at 9. Caleb climbed into her car, his nerves jangling. They drove in silence for a while before she finally spoke. "Caleb, I need to be honest with you. The program I mentioned? It's not just about teaching skills. It's about teaching young people how to navigate a world that doesn't always treat them fairly." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "You saw it yesterday, didn't you? The way people looked at you. The way they assumed the worst. That wasn't just bad luck, Caleb. That's how the world is sometimes. But it doesn't have to stop you. If you're willing to learn, I can help you rise above it." Her words hit Caleb like a ton of bricks. He hadn't thought about it that way before, but she was right. The way people had treated him yesterday hadn't been fair. "I'm ready to learn," he said quietly. Mrs. Montgomery smiled, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "Good, because the road ahead won't be easy. But if you stick with it, I promise it'll be worth it." They pulled into the parking lot of a sleek office building. As they stepped inside, Caleb's heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. He had no idea what to expect, but he was about to find out. The sleek office building was unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. The floors sparkled, the walls were lined with modern art, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and polish. As they walked through the glass doors, Caleb felt small and out of place. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet lobby. "Welcome to Horizon Mentorship Center," Mrs. Montgomery said, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. "This is where the magic happens." Caleb followed her, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He wasn't sure what kind of magic she was talking about, but he was too nervous to ask. They stopped at a reception desk where a young woman greeted Mrs. Montgomery with a wide smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery. Conference room B is ready for you," the woman said, glancing curiously at Caleb. "Thank you, Stephanie," Mrs. Montgomery replied. She motioned for Caleb to follow her down a long hallway. As they walked, Caleb couldn't help but notice the stares. People in sharp suits and dresses glanced his way, some smiling politely, others looking confused or even disapproving. He kept his head down, wishing he could melt into the floor. When they reached the conference room, Mrs. Montgomery opened the door and gestured for Caleb to enter. Inside, a group of 6 teenagers sat around a large table. They were all dressed better than Caleb, their clothes neat and stylish. He felt a pang of self-consciousness as he took a seat at the far end of the table. "Everyone, this is Caleb Jones," Mrs. Montgomery said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "He's joining the program today. Let's make him feel welcome." The others nodded or murmured greetings, but Caleb could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up. One boy, tall and lean with a smirk on his face, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "What's up, new kid?" Caleb managed a small smile. "Hi." Mrs. Montgomery clapped her hands. "All right, let's get started. Today, we're talking about perception and how to handle being underestimated." She launched into a presentation, using slides and videos to explain how people often judge others based on appearances. Caleb listened intently, realizing how much her words mirrored his own experiences. He thought about the crowd from the day before, the way they had jumped to conclusions about him without knowing anything about who he was. As the session continued, Mrs. Montgomery encouraged the group to share their thoughts. Caleb stayed quiet, unsure of what to say. But when one of the girls, a petite girl with curly hair named Jasmine, spoke about being dismissed because of her size, Caleb felt a flicker of connection. "It's like people don't think you can do anything just because of how you look," Jasmine said. "But you have to prove them wrong." Mrs. Montgomery nodded. "Exactly. and proving them wrong takes confidence and preparation. That's what this program is all about. After the session, Mrs. Montgomery pulled Caleb aside. "How are you feeling so far?" she asked. "It's different," Caleb admitted. "But I liked what Jasmine said." Mrs. Montgomery smiled. "I thought you might. You'll have plenty of chances to share your own experiences, too." As they walked back to her car, Caleb's nerves began to fade. For the first time, he felt like he might actually belong here. But as they pulled out of the parking lot, Mrs. Montgomery's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked. "It's nothing," she said, but her tone was clipped. The rest of the ride was quiet. When they reached Caleb's house, she parked and turned to him. "Tomorrow, I want you to think about what you want to get out of this program," she said. "It's important to have goals." "Okay," Caleb said. "I will." She nodded and drove off, leaving Caleb standing in the driveway with more questions than answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was bothering her, but he didn't know her well enough to ask. The next day, Mrs. Montgomery picked him up as promised. This time the atmosphere was more tense. She seemed distracted, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel as they drove. "Is everything okay?" Caleb asked cautiously. Mrs. Montgomery hesitated. "Caleb, have you ever had someone try to sabotage you? Try to tear you down just because they didn't think you deserved what you had?" He thought about the crowd from 2 days ago, about the accusations and the way they'd looked at him like he was nothing. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think so." She nodded grimly. "Good. Then you'll understand why today's lesson is important." At the center, the session was focused on resilience, how to bounce back from setbacks and keep pushing forward. Caleb found himself more engaged this time, especially when Mrs. Montgomery shared a story about her own struggles. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood, facing constant doubt from people who thought she wouldn't amount to anything. "They were wrong," she said firmly. But proving that took years of hard work. As Caleb listened, he felt a spark of inspiration. If she could overcome those challenges, maybe he could too. He decided to speak up during the discussion, sharing what had happened when he helped her with the flat tire. "People didn't believe me when I said I was just trying to help," he said. "They thought I was stealing or something." The room went quiet. Jasmine nodded in understanding, and even the smirking boy from the day before looked thoughtful. "That's exactly why programs like this exist," Mrs. Montgomery said. "To give you the tools to prove them wrong." Caleb felt a surge of determination. Maybe this was where he was meant to be after all. But just as the session ended and the teens began to leave, Mrs. Montgomery's phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at it and sighed deeply. "Caleb," she said, her voice unusually serious. "We need to talk." "What's wrong?" he asked, his stomach tightening. She hesitated, then showed him the screen. It was an email, but Caleb could only read the subject line. "Concerns about your new protege." Before he could ask what it meant, Mrs. Montgomery turned the phone away and gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it," she said, but her eyes told a different story. Caleb didn't know what was going on, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever it was far from over. Caleb couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as they drove back to his neighborhood. Mrs. Montgomery's cheerful demeanor seemed forced, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The email subject line he'd seen replayed in his mind. "Concerns about your new protege." He glanced at her. "Mrs. Montgomery, is everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured. "Caleb, sometimes people don't like change, and when you start to challenge their expectations, they push back. But it's nothing you need to worry about." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they'd only made Caleb more anxious. "Who sent that email?" he asked. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you focus on the program and keep doing your best." Caleb wanted to press her for more information, but her tone signaled the conversation was over. They spent the rest of the ride in silence, the tension thick between them. When they arrived at his house, Mrs. Montgomery smiled faintly. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning, she said. Okay, Caleb replied, though his mind was buzzing with questions. As he walked up the driveway, he noticed his grandma peeking out from behind the curtains. She opened the door just as he reached the porch. "What's going on, Caleb?" she asked, her voice low. "Nothing," Caleb said, shrugging. "Just another day at the program." She studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You sure about that? You look like you've got something on your mind." Caleb hesitated. He wanted to tell her about the email about the strange way Mrs. Montgomery had been acting, but he wasn't sure if he should. Instead, he said, "It's nothing, Grandma. I'm just tired." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. "All right, supper's in the kitchen. Eat something and get some rest." Caleb nodded and went inside, but as he sat at the table, thinking at his food, the weight of the day lingered. The next morning, Mrs. Montgomery was waiting for him as promised. Caleb climbed into her car, noticing the strained look on her face. "Morning," he said cautiously. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile. "We've got an important session today. Are you ready?" "Yeah," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. When they arrived at the center, the energy in the room felt different. The other teens greeted Caleb with more warmth than before. But Mrs. Montgomery seemed distracted. She kept glancing at her phone, her lips pressed into a thin line. The session began with a discussion about overcoming adversity. Mrs. Montgomery shared more of her story, recounting how she'd faced discrimination and doubt throughout her career. Caleb found himself inspired again, nodding along as she spoke. But halfway through the session, a knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Montgomery frowned and stepped out to see who it was. The room fell quiet as the teens exchanged curious glances. Caleb strained to hear what was happening, but the conversation outside was muffled. When Mrs. Montgomery returned, her face was pale. "I'll be back shortly," she said, her voice tight. "Stephanie will take over for now." As she left, Caleb couldn't help but wonder what was going on. After the session, Caleb lingered in the hallway, waiting for Mrs. Montgomery to return. When she finally appeared, she looked exhausted. "Caleb," she said, motioning for him to follow her. They walked to her office, where she closed the door and sat down heavily in her chair. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice somber. Caleb's stomach churned. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "Someone from the board of the mentorship program has expressed concerns about you being here." "What kind of concerns?" Caleb asked, his chest tightening. She hesitated, then said, "They think you don't fit the program's image. That maybe I made a mistake by bringing you in." Caleb's heart sank. "What do you mean, don't fit?" Mrs. Montgomery's expression hardened. "It's nonsense, Caleb, but it's rooted in the same kind of prejudice you've already experienced. They don't see your potential the way I do." He looked down at his hands, anger and embarrassment swirling inside him. "So what happens now?" "Nothing," she said firmly. "I'm not giving up on you, but I wanted you to know what we're up against." Caleb nodded slowly. He appreciated her honesty, but the weight of her words felt crushing. That evening, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Montgomery had said. He thought about the crowd that had accused him of stealing, about the stares he'd gotten at the mentorship center, and now this. No matter how hard he tried, it felt like the world was determined to hold him back. But as he sat in his room staring at the $50 bill still tucked on his nightstand, he felt a spark of determination. If Mrs. Montgomery believed in him, maybe he could prove everyone else wrong. The next day, he arrived at the center with a renewed sense of purpose. The session was about setting goals and creating a plan to achieve them. When it was his turn to share, Caleb stood up and said, "I want to show people they're wrong about me. I want to prove that I can do something great." The room fell silent, and then Jasmine smiled. "I believe you can," she said. Mrs. Montgomery nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." For the first time, Caleb felt like he had a real chance. But just as the session ended and he began to leave, Mrs. Montgomery's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and froze, her face going pale. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We've got a problem," she said. Before Caleb could ask what she meant, the door to the conference room burst open, and a man in a suit stormed in. His eyes were cold as they locked onto Caleb. "This ends now," the man said, his voice cutting through the room like ice. Caleb's heart raced as Mrs. Montgomery stepped in front of him, her voice firm. "What are you doing here?" The man ignored her, pointing at Caleb. "He doesn't belong here." The room fell into stunned silence, and Caleb's world felt like it was crashing down around him. The room was so silent Caleb could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. The man in the suit, tall and imposing, stood rigidly near the doorway, his eyes fixed on him with a cold, unwavering stare. Mrs. Montgomery didn't move, standing squarely between Caleb and the man as if to shield him. "What do you mean he doesn't belong here?" she said, her voice sharp and controlled. The man's lips thinned. "You know exactly what I mean, Evelyn. This program has a reputation to uphold, and bringing him in jeopardizes that." Caleb felt a wave of confusion and anger. "I haven't done anything wrong," he blurted out. The man's gaze shifted to him, filled with disdain. "This isn't about what you've done. It's about what you represent. This program is meant to cultivate young leaders with promise, not charity cases." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. His fists clenched at his sides as shame and anger roiled inside him. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. "That's enough, Roger," Mrs. Montgomery said, her tone ice cold. "You're out of line." "I'm out of line?" Roger shot back. "You're the one risking everything we've built here. Do you have any idea how much pushback I've gotten from the board because of him? Sponsors are asking questions, Evelyn. Questions I can't answer." Mrs. Montgomery crossed her arms, her chin held high. "Then maybe you should tell them the truth. That Caleb is one of the most promising young people I've ever met." Roger scoffed. "Promising? He's an unproven kid from—" "Don't." Mrs. Montgomery cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "Don't finish that sentence." The tension in the room was suffocating. Caleb could feel the eyes of the other teens on him, their expressions ranging from shock to sympathy. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and even the smirking boy from before looked uneasy. Roger exhaled sharply and straightened his tie. "This isn't personal, Evelyn. It's business, and I'm telling you now, the board will not support this decision. If you keep him in the program, there will be consequences." Mrs. Montgomery's jaw tightened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Roger said flatly. "Think about it." He cast one last glance at Caleb, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking out the door. The moment he was gone, the room seemed to exhale all at once. Caleb sank back into his chair, his head spinning. He felt humiliated, exposed, and angry all at the same time. Mrs. Montgomery turned to him, her expression softening. "Are you all right?" "No," Caleb said honestly. "Why does he hate me? He doesn't even know me." "He doesn't hate you, Caleb," Mrs. Montgomery said gently. "He fears what you represent, a challenge to the status quo. People like Roger thrive in systems that exclude others. They don't like it when someone comes along and proves they don't have all the answers." Caleb nodded slowly, though her words didn't make him feel any better. "So what happens now?" Mrs. Montgomery's eyes hardened with determination. "What happens now is that we keep going. Roger doesn't get to decide your future, Caleb. You do." Her words lit a small spark of hope in Caleb's chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Could he really overcome something this big? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Caleb went through the motions of the session, but his mind was elsewhere. When Mrs. Montgomery dropped him off at home, he felt too drained to even explain what had happened to his grandma. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Roger's words over and over. Charity case. The phrase stuck in his head like a thorn. But then he thought about Mrs. Montgomery and how fiercely she had defended him. If she believed in him, maybe he could believe in himself too. The next morning, he woke up with a new resolve. If Roger wanted to see him fail, Caleb was determined to prove him wrong. At the center, Mrs. Montgomery greeted him with a proud smile. "Ready for today?" she asked. "Yeah," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. The session was about leadership, focusing on how to take charge in difficult situations. Caleb threw himself into the exercises, surprising even himself with how much he had to say. By the end of the day, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. But just as he was gathering his things to leave, Jasmine pulled him aside. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet. "That guy from yesterday, Roger. He was wrong about you." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "Thanks." "I mean it," she said. "You belong here as much as anyone else. Don't let him get to you." Her words meant more to Caleb than he could say. "I won't," he promised. As he walked to Mrs. Montgomery's car, he felt lighter than he had in days, but that feeling didn't last long. When they arrived at his house, there was a car parked in the driveway, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Caleb froze, his stomach dropping. Mrs. Montgomery frowned. "Do you know who that is?" "No," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. They stepped out of the car cautiously. The front door opened, and Caleb's grandma appeared on the porch, her face lined with worry. "Caleb," she called, "you need to come inside." "What's going on?" he asked, hurrying up the steps. She glanced over her shoulder. "There's someone here to see you. They said it's urgent." Caleb stepped into the living room and stopped short. Sitting on the couch was a man in a dark suit, holding a briefcase. His expression was unreadable, but his presence radiated authority. "Caleb Jones," the man said, standing and extending a hand. Yeah," Caleb stammered, shaking his hand. "My name is Mr. Whitman," the man said, his tone formal. "I'm here to discuss some developments regarding your involvement in Mrs. Montgomery's program." Caleb's heart pounded. What kind of developments? Whitman opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Let's just say there are people who aren't happy about your participation, and they're willing to go to great lengths to make sure you're removed." Mrs. Montgomery stepped forward, her voice sharp. "What is this about, Whitman? Who sent you?" Whitman didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to Caleb and said, "You might want to reconsider your involvement before things get complicated." The room fell silent, and Caleb felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at Mrs. Montgomery, who looked ready to fight, but he knew this wasn't just her battle. "I'm not quitting," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly, and he smiled faintly. "We'll see about that." With that, he closed his briefcase, nodded politely, and left. The sound of the door closing echoed in the silence that followed. Mrs. Montgomery turned to Caleb, her expression fierce. "Don't let them scare you," she said. "I won't," Caleb said, though his hands were trembling. But deep down he couldn't help but wonder, what would they do next? The silence in the house was heavy after Mr. Whitman left. Caleb's grandma looked at him with concern etched deeply into her face, but she didn't say anything right away. Mrs. Montgomery paced the room, her heels clicking against the floor as she muttered under her breath. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Why are they doing this? I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Montgomery stopped pacing and turned to him. "It's not about what you've done, Caleb. It's about what you represent. Whitman and people like him see you as a threat, not because of who you are, but because of what you could become." Caleb frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does to them," she said, her voice tight. "You being here challenges their assumptions, their power. They don't want someone like you proving them wrong." His grandma cleared her throat, her voice heavy with concern. "Caleb, I don't like this. These people seem serious, and I don't want you getting hurt." "I'm not quitting," Caleb said firmly. "I can't. If I quit, they win." Mrs. Montgomery nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. But we'll have to be careful. Whitman didn't show up here by accident. Someone sent him, and whoever it is won't stop easily." The gravity of her words settled over Caleb like a storm cloud. He felt a knot of fear in his chest, but he refused to let it show. That night, as he lay in bed, He replayed the encounter with Whitman over and over. The man's calm, calculating demeanor had been terrifying, but it also made Caleb angry. Why did these people think they could decide his future? The next day at the mentorship center, Caleb arrived early, determined to prove that he belonged there. The other teens greeted him with a mixture of encouragement and curiosity, clearly aware that something was going on. "Hey, Caleb," Jasmine said as they walked into the conference room. "You okay?" "Yeah," Caleb said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Jasmine nodded. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." The session began with a workshop on public speaking led by a guest instructor. Caleb threw himself into the exercises, focusing on projecting confidence and clarity. By the end of the session, he felt a flicker of pride. He had done well, and even the instructor had praised his progress. As they were leaving, Mrs. Montgomery pulled Caleb aside. "Can you stay for a bit?" she asked. "Sure," Caleb said, though he felt a pang of nervousness. Once the room was empty, Mrs. Montgomery closed the door and sat across from him. "I've been doing some digging," she said, "and I found out who sent Whitman." Caleb leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Who?" "Roger," she said, her voice filled with disdain. "He's been pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to get you out of the program. But it's more than that. He's also been spreading rumors to the board, claiming you're a liability." Caleb felt a surge of anger. How can he just lie like that? "Because people like Roger don't care about the truth," Mrs. Montgomery said. "They care about control, and they see you as something they can't control." "What do we do?" Caleb asked. "We fight back," she said firmly. "But we'll have to be smart about it. I have a meeting with the board tomorrow to defend your place in the program. I want you to come with me." Caleb's eyes widened. "Me? Why?" "Because they need to see you, Caleb," she said. "Not the version of you Roger is trying to paint, but the real you. The person who's kind, hardworking, and determined to succeed." Caleb hesitated. The idea of standing in front of the board, defending himself, was terrifying. But he knew Mrs. Montgomery was right. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." The next day, Caleb dressed in the best clothes he had, a button-up shirt and khakis that were slightly too big. Mrs. Montgomery picked him up early, her own nerves visible despite her composed demeanor. "Just be yourself," she said as they drove. "Speak from the heart. That's all you need to do." When they arrived at the boardroom, Caleb's palms were sweating. The room was intimidating, with a long table surrounded by men and women in suits. Roger sat near the middle, his expression smug as he watched Caleb walk in. Mrs. Montgomery introduced Caleb and began her presentation, outlining his achievements and potential. She spoke passionately, her words cutting through the tension in the room. Finally, it was Caleb's turn. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly, and faced the board. "My name is Caleb Jones," he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger. "I know some of you think I don't belong here. But I'm not here because I want a handout. I'm here because I want to work hard and prove myself. I've learned a lot from this program, and I know I have a lot more to learn. But I'm not going to give up just because some people don't believe in me." The room was silent as Caleb finished. He glanced at Mrs. Montgomery, who gave him an encouraging nod. Roger cleared his throat, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's a nice speech, but we have to consider the bigger picture. This program isn't just about helping individuals. It's about maintaining a reputation, and I'm not sure Caleb fits that image." Before Caleb could respond, one of the board members spoke up. "I disagree," she said. "What I see is a young man with courage and determination. Isn't that exactly what this program is supposed to nurture?" The room erupted into a heated discussion, with some members siding with Roger and others defending Caleb. Mrs. Montgomery stood her ground, countering every argument with facts and passion. After what felt like an eternity, the head of the board called for a vote. Caleb held his breath as the votes were tallied. When the decision was announced, Mrs. Montgomery smiled triumphantly. "You're staying in the program, Caleb," she said. Relief and pride washed over him, But his victory was short-lived. As they left the boardroom, Roger approached them, his expression dark. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "You've made a powerful enemy today." Mrs. Montgomery squared her shoulders. "We're not afraid of you, Roger." Roger smirked. "You should be." As he walked away, Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Caleb's victory felt bittersweet. He was still in the program, but Roger's parting words lingered in his mind, unsettling and ominous. The look in the man's eyes wasn't just anger. It was a promise of retaliation. As Mrs. Montgomery drove him home, she remained quiet, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "What do you think he meant by this isn't over?" She sighed deeply. "Roger's the type of person who doesn't like losing. He'll try to make things harder for you, for me, maybe even for the program as a whole. But don't let that scare you, Caleb. We'll handle whatever comes next." Her reassurance helped, but not entirely. Caleb nodded, staring out the window as the town blurred past. When they reached his house, Mrs. Montgomery stopped him before he got out. "Caleb, I'm proud of you," she said. "You stood your ground in there. Not many people your age could do that." "Thanks," Caleb said, managing a small smile. As he walked up to the porch, his grandma was already there waiting for him, her arms crossed. "Well?" she asked. "I'm still in the program," Caleb said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. His grandma smiled, a rare moment of softness breaking through her usual stern demeanor. "Good. But don't let your guard down. People like that Roger fella don't give up easy." "I know, Grandma," Caleb said, his stomach nodding at the reminder. The next week at the mentorship center, Caleb threw himself into the program with renewed determination. The sessions grew more intense, pushing him to develop skills he didn't know he had. Public speaking, teamwork, problem-solving. Every day brought new challenges, and Caleb tackled them head-on. The other teens began warming up to him, especially Jasmine. She often stayed late to help Caleb practice presentations or brainstorm ideas for group projects. Even Marcus, the boy who had initially smirked at Caleb's arrival, started treating him with respect. "You're tougher than I thought, Jones," Marcus said one afternoon after a particularly grueling debate exercise. "Thanks," Caleb said, grinning. "You're not so bad yourself." Despite the progress he was making, the tension with Roger loomed like a storm cloud. Caleb noticed subtle changes around the center, staff whispering in hallways, Mrs. Montgomery taking more phone calls behind closed doors. One day, Caleb overheard a heated conversation between Mrs. Montgomery and someone on the phone. "I won't let you undermine everything we've built," she said sharply. "The program is about giving opportunities, not maintaining appearances." Caleb couldn't hear the response, but whatever it was made Mrs. Montgomery's face harden. "Do what you have to do, but I'm not backing down," she said before hanging up. When she turned and saw Caleb standing nearby, she forced a smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but strained. "Yeah," Caleb said, though he didn't believe her. 2 weeks later, the storm finally broke. Caleb arrived at the center one morning to find a crowd gathered outside. Staff members whispered among themselves, while some of the teens exchanged nervous glances. Caleb spotted Jasmine and Marcus near the entrance. "What's going on?" he asked. "Someone's here to do an inspection," Jasmine said, her voice low. "They're saying the program might get shut down." Caleb's heart sank. "What? Why?" "No one knows for sure," Marcus said, glancing toward the building. "But everyone's saying Roger has something to do with it." Before Caleb could respond, the doors opened and a tall man in a gray suit stepped out, flanked by 2 other officials. He held a clipboard and addressed the group. "Good morning," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "I'm Mr. Hanley, here on behalf of the program's sponsors. We've received complaints about mismanagement and misconduct, and we're conducting a thorough review. Effective immediately, all sessions are suspended." A ripple of shock and anger swept through the crowd. Caleb's fists clenched as he saw Roger standing in the background, a smug smile on his face. Mrs. Montgomery emerged from the building, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with anger. "This is unnecessary, Hanley," she said. "The program has been running smoothly." "That remains to be seen," Hanley replied. "Until the review is complete, no further activities will be permitted." Caleb felt a surge of frustration. All his hard work, all his progress, it couldn't end like this. He pushed through the crowd, his voice rising. "This isn't fair," he shouted. "You can't shut us down just because someone doesn't like us." Hanley glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "And you are." "Caleb Jones," he said firmly. "I'm part of this program, and it's changed my life. Shutting it down isn't just unfair. It's wrong." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Caleb's words. Even Jasmine and Marcus stepped forward to voice their support. Mrs. Montgomery placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, her pride evident despite the tense situation. "This program exists for young people like Caleb," she said. "People who deserve a chance to prove themselves." Hanley hesitated, clearly taken aback by the outpouring of support. He glanced at Roger, who was watching with narrowed eyes. "We'll take your input into consideration," Hanley said finally. "But the review stands." As the officials left, the crowd began to disperse, their mood somber. Caleb turned to Mrs. Montgomery, his voice tight. "What do we do now?" "We don't give up," she said firmly. "This isn't the end, Caleb. It's just another fight we have to win." But as Caleb looked around at the worried faces of the other teens, he couldn't help but wonder if this fight was bigger than any of them could handle. The suspension of the program hit Caleb harder than he expected. For weeks, the mentorship center had been his escape, a place where he felt he was finally moving forward. Now it felt like everything was slipping away, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Mrs. Montgomery assured everyone that she was working to resolve the issue. But the process was slow and filled with roadblocks. Roger's influence seemed to stretch further than any of them had anticipated. Caleb sat on the steps of his grandmother's house, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. He tossed a baseball between his hands, trying to quiet the frustration boiling inside him. Jasmine and Marcus walked up the street toward him, their expressions as troubled as his own. "Hey," Jasmine said, sitting down beside him. "Hey," Caleb replied, his tone flat. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, crossing his arms. "Any news?" "Nothing yet," Caleb said, shaking his head. Jasmine sighed. "I don't get it. Why would they want to shut down something that's helping people?" "Because it's not about us," Marcus said bitterly. "It's about control. Roger doesn't care what happens to us as long as he gets his way." Caleb looked up at them, a new determination flickering in his eyes. "Then we can't just sit around and let him win." Jasmine frowned. "What can we do? They've already suspended everything." "We can fight back," Caleb said. "If Mrs. Montgomery is fighting for us, we need to fight for her too." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Caleb thought for a moment, then stood up. "We tell people our stories. The sponsors, the board, anyone who will listen. If they hear how much this program has done for us, they'll see that shutting it down is a mistake." Jasmine's face lit up. "That's actually a good idea." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, if enough people speak out, they'll have to listen." The next day, Caleb gathered as many of the other teens from the program as he could. They met in the park, sitting in a circle on the grass. Caleb explained his plan, and while some were hesitant at first, others quickly got on board. "I don't know about this," said a boy named Anthony. "What if it just makes things worse?" "It won't," Jasmine said firmly. "If we don't do something, the program's as good as gone anyway." "That's right," Caleb added. "We've got nothing to lose and everything to fight for." Eventually, everyone agreed to participate. They decided to record videos of themselves sharing what the program meant to them and how it had impacted their lives. Caleb borrowed his grandma's old camcorder, and they spent the afternoon filming. Each teen spoke from the heart. Jasmine talked about how the program had given her the confidence to stand up for herself. Marcus shared how it had taught him leadership skills he never thought he had. When it was Caleb's turn, he hesitated for a moment, then looked directly into the camera. "This program gave me a chance when no one else would," he said. "It showed me that I'm more than what people assume about me. I'm not just some kid from the neighborhood. I'm someone who can make a difference." That evening, Caleb and Jasmine stayed up late editing the videos and compiling them into one powerful message. They uploaded it to social media, tagging the program's sponsors and board members. By morning, the video had been shared dozens of times, and comments were pouring in from people who supported their cause. "This is incredible," Jasmine said, scrolling through the responses on her phone. But not everyone was supportive. Some comments echoed the same prejudices they were fighting against. "Maybe there's a reason the program's being shut down," one comment read. "They're just kids looking for handouts," said another. Caleb's heart sank as he read the negativity, but Jasmine put a hand on his shoulder. "Ignore them," she said. "Focus on the people who are with us." The video quickly gained traction, catching the attention of local media. A reporter reached out to Caleb, asking for an interview. Nervous but determined, he agreed. The interview aired on the evening news, with Caleb speaking passionately about the importance of the mentorship program. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about creating opportunities for kids like us who are trying to do something positive." The next morning, Mrs. Montgomery called Caleb. "Caleb," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I saw the video and the interview. You have no idea how proud I am of you. This is exactly what we needed." Caleb smiled, relief washing over him. "Do you think it will make a difference?" "I do," she said. "In fact, it already has. I just got a call from one of the sponsors. They want to meet with us." The meeting was scheduled for the following week at the Mentorship Center. Caleb, Mrs. Montgomery, and a few other teens, including Jasmine and Marcus, prepared tirelessly. They rehearsed what they would say, focusing on the positive impact of the program and their determination to see it continue. On the day of the meeting, Caleb's nerves were at an all-time high. The sponsors were a mix of wealthy individuals and representatives from large corporations, all dressed in expensive suits. Roger was there too, his expression smug as he sat at the head of the table. Mrs. Montgomery began with a heartfelt presentation, laying out the program's accomplishments and goals. Then she invited Caleb and the others to share their stories. Caleb stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on Roger for a moment before turning to the sponsors. "My name is Caleb Jones," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "And this program has changed my life. It's taught me skills I never thought I could have, and given me hope for a future I wasn't sure I'd ever see. Shutting it down would mean taking away that hope, not just from me, but from everyone here." The room was silent as Caleb sat down. He glanced at Mrs. Montgomery, who gave him an encouraging nod. One of the sponsors, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. "Your story is inspiring. I think we've heard enough to make a decision." Roger's smirk faltered slightly, but he said nothing as the sponsors began deliberating. The room grew tense as they discussed the program's future. Finally, the head sponsor stood up. "We've decided," she said. "The program will continue." Cheers erupted from the teens, and Mrs. Montgomery smiled, her eyes shining with pride. But as the room celebrated, Roger stood and walked out without a word, his face dark with anger. Caleb's joy was tempered by a lingering unease. This victory felt monumental, but he knew Roger wasn't finished yet, and Caleb would have to be ready for whatever came next. The celebration at the Mentorship Center was electric. The teens laughed, hugged, and cheered as they realized their fight had paid off. Mrs. Montgomery stood at the center of it all, her smile brighter than Caleb had ever seen. "You did it," she told Caleb, pulling him aside. "You and the others proved that your voices matter. Never forget that." Caleb grinned, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that could truly make a difference. But the feeling of triumph was short-lived. As the crowd thinned and Caleb prepared to head home, Mrs. Montgomery's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and the smile slipped from her face. "What is it?" Caleb asked, noticing the shift in her demeanor. She hesitated before showing him the text. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. "You might have won this round, but it's not over. Watch your back." Caleb's stomach twisted. "Do you think it's Roger?" "Most likely," Mrs. Montgomery said, her voice calm but steely. "He's not the type to let go easily. What are we going to do?" "We're going to keep moving forward," she said firmly. "He can threaten us all he wants, but as long as we stick together, we'll be okay." Caleb nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. Over the next few weeks, the program resumed and Caleb threw himself into the sessions with renewed determination. The other teens seemed just as motivated, their bond stronger than ever after their shared victory. But Roger's shadow lingered. He stopped showing up at the center, but his absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it felt like he was lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. One afternoon, Caleb was walking home from the center when he noticed a black car parked at the corner of his street. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled softly. He paused, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The car didn't move as he walked past, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. When he got home, he told his grandma about the car. "You think it's connected to that Roger man?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Maybe," Caleb said. "It just felt off." His grandma sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Caleb, I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in. But I need you to be careful, okay? If something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts." "I will," Caleb promised. The next day, things took a more unsettling turn. Mrs. Montgomery arrived at the center to find her office door slightly ajar. When she stepped inside, she froze. Her desk had been ransacked, papers strewn everywhere. Caleb and the other teens arrived shortly after, only to find the police at the scene. "What happened?" Caleb asked, his heart pounding. Mrs. Montgomery glanced at him, her face tight with anger. "Someone broke in last night. They were looking for something." "Did they take anything?" Jasmine asked. "Not that I can tell," Mrs. Montgomery said. "But the message is clear." Caleb clenched his fists. "It's Roger, isn't it?" Mrs. Montgomery didn't answer directly, but the look in her eyes said enough. The break-in rattled everyone. The teens stuck closer together during sessions, and Mrs. Montgomery increased security measures at the center. But the feeling of being targeted lingered, casting a shadow over their progress. One evening, Mrs. Montgomery called Caleb. Her voice was calm but urgent. "Caleb, I need you to come to the center tomorrow morning earlier than usual," she said. "Why? What's going on?" "I'll explain then," she said. "Just trust me." Caleb agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, he arrived at the center to find Mrs. Montgomery waiting for him. She ushered him into her office, where a man in a plain suit sat at her desk. "Caleb, this is Detective Harris," she said. "He's been assigned to investigate what's been happening here." Caleb sat down, his nerves jangling. "Is it about Roger?" "We're looking into all possibilities," Harris said, his tone neutral. "Mrs. Montgomery mentioned you've been involved in some of the recent events. I just want to ask you a few questions." The detective's questions ranged from Caleb's experiences with Roger to the suspicious car he'd seen near his house. Caleb answered honestly, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "Thank you, Caleb," Harris said when they finished. "We're doing everything we can to ensure your safety and the safety of this program." As Caleb left the office, Mrs. Montgomery gave him a reassuring smile. "You did well," she said. "We'll get through this." But as the day went on, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. That evening, as Caleb walked home, he noticed the same black car parked at the corner. This time the engine wasn't running, but the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. Before he could decide what to do, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out dressed in dark clothes with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Hey, kid," the man called, his voice rough. "Got a minute?" Caleb's heart raced as he froze in place. The man took a step closer, and Caleb's instincts screamed at him to run. But before he could move, the man reached into his jacket and pulled something out. Caleb's breath caught as he realized what it was. The man's hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a thick envelope. Caleb's heart was pounding so hard he could barely think, but his feet stayed rooted to the spot. "Relax, kid," the man said, his voice gruff but not threatening. "This is for you." "For me?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. The man nodded, tossing the envelope onto the sidewalk between them. "Just read it. And remember, there are easier ways to go through life." With that, the man turned, got back into the car, and drove off without another word. Caleb stared at the envelope, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to leave it where it was, but curiosity got the better of him. He crouched down, picked it up, and carefully opened it. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills and a folded piece of paper. Caleb's hands shook as he unfolded the note, which read, "Leave the program. Take the money. No one gets hurt." The message was simple, but the weight of it hit Caleb like a brick. He stuffed the envelope into his backpack and ran the rest of the way home. When he burst through the front door, his grandma was in the kitchen washing dishes. She turned, startled by his sudden entrance. "Caleb, what's wrong?" He hesitated, unsure if he should tell her. But as her eyes searched his face, he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Someone gave me this," he said, pulling the envelope from his backpack and setting it on the table. His grandma dried her hands, her face darkening as she read the note. "Who gave you this?" "I don't know," Caleb said. "Some guy in a car. He didn't say who he was, but I think it's Roger, or someone working for him." Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the note back on the table. "This is serious, Caleb. You can't ignore it." "I'm not quitting, Grandma," Caleb said, his voice firm. "No matter what they do." She sighed deeply, shaking her head. "You've got more courage than most grown men, Caleb. But courage doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful. We need to tell Mrs. Montgomery about this." The next morning, Caleb arrived at the mentorship center early and went straight to Mrs. Montgomery's office. He explained what had happened, showing her the note and the money. Her face hardened as she read the message. "This is an escalation," she said, her voice grim. "They're not just trying to intimidate you anymore. They're trying to buy you off." "What do we do?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Montgomery leaned back in her chair, her mind working quickly. "First, we're turning this over to the police. They need to know just how far Roger, or whoever is behind this, is willing to go. And second, we're going to keep moving forward, no matter what they throw at us." Caleb nodded, the determination in her voice giving him strength. That afternoon, Detective Harris arrived to collect the envelope as evidence. He asked Caleb more questions about the man who had approached him, but Caleb could only give vague descriptions. "Don't worry," Harris said. "We'll look into this. In the meantime, keep your guard up." Despite the growing tension, the program continued. Caleb and the other teams worked harder than ever, using their progress as a form of defiance against the threats looming over them. But the intimidation tactics didn't stop. One evening, Caleb returned home to find his front porch vandalized with spray-painted words. "This isn't your fight." His grandma called the police immediately, but Caleb refused to let fear take hold. "I'm not backing down," he told her, "no matter what they do." His resolve inspired the other teens, who rallied around him. Jasmine and Marcus organized a public showcase of the program's work, inviting sponsors, community leaders, and the media. The event was meant to show the world that they wouldn't be silenced. On the night of the showcase, the Mentorship Center buzzed with energy. Teens presented their projects, shared their stories, and performed skits they had created to highlight the importance of the program. Caleb gave a speech about his journey, earning a standing ovation from the crowd. Mrs. Montgomery beamed with pride as she addressed the audience. This program isn't just about teaching skills. It's about changing lives, and these young people are living proof of its success. But as the event drew to a close, Caleb noticed a familiar figure lurking near the back of the room. Roger stood with his arms crossed, his expression dark. As the audience began to disperse, Roger approached Mrs. Montgomery and Caleb. "This was impressive," Roger said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But don't think for a second that this changes anything." Mrs. Montgomery stepped in front of Caleb, her voice sharp. "You've lost, Roger. The program is stronger than ever, and nothing you do will change that." Roger's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "We'll see about that," he said before turning and walking out. Caleb watched him leave, a mix of relief and unease swirling in his chest. The showcase had been a success, but Roger's words lingered like a dark cloud. As the mentorship center emptied and the lights dimmed, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The night of the showcase marked a turning point. Caleb felt a renewed sense of purpose, but Roger's veiled threat haunted him. Despite the success of the event, it was clear that Roger wasn't finished. Caleb couldn't help but wonder what his next move would be. The following week started quietly. Caleb focused on his sessions at the mentorship center, and for a while, it seemed like things were returning to normal. But the calm didn't last. One morning, Caleb arrived at the center to find the parking lot empty and the front doors locked. A note taped to the glass read, "Closed until further notice. Contact the board for updates." Confused and alarmed, Caleb called Mrs. Montgomery. She picked up on the first ring. "Caleb, I was about to call you," she said, her voice tense. Roger pulled another stunt. He convinced the board to shut down the center temporarily for a compliance review. "What does that even mean?" Caleb asked, his frustration boiling over. "It's a fancy way of saying he's trying to undermine us again," she said. "But don't worry, I'm already working on a plan." Caleb clenched his fists. "What can I do to help?" "Stay focused and stay strong," she said. "I might need you and the others to step up again soon." Later that day, Mrs. Montgomery gathered Caleb, Jasmine, Marcus, and a few other teens at a local library to strategize. Roger's main argument is that the program is disorganized and poorly managed, she explained. "We need to prove otherwise by showcasing how structured and impactful our work has been." "How do we do that?" Jasmine asked. "We gather evidence, reports, testimonials, anything that demonstrates the program's success," Mrs. Montgomery said, "and we make it impossible for them to ignore us." The group sprang into action, compiling data and reaching out to former participants who could vouch for the program's value. Caleb worked late into the night, poring over spreadsheets and helping organize files. A week later, armed with their findings, Mrs. Montgomery arranged a meeting with the board to present their case. Caleb and a few other teens accompanied her, ready to speak if necessary. The boardroom was tense as Mrs. Montgomery began her presentation, walking them through the program's achievements and addressing every point of contention Roger had raised. Caleb watched the board members closely, trying to gauge their reactions. Roger, seated at the far end of the table, looked increasingly frustrated as Mrs. Montgomery dismantled his arguments one by one. When she finished, the head of the board turned to Caleb. "Caleb, you've been one of the most vocal participants in this program. Is there anything you'd like to add?" Caleb stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "This program isn't just about learning skills. It's about changing lives. It's given me and so many others a chance to prove ourselves, to grow into the people we want to be. Shutting it down would take that chance away from all of us." The room was silent for a moment before the head of the board nodded. "Thank you, Caleb." After a lengthy deliberation, the board announced their decision. The program would reopen immediately. The victory was bittersweet. While the program was saved once again, it was clear that Roger's influence was still a threat. Mrs. Montgomery pulled Caleb aside after the meeting. "You were incredible in there," she said. "But we need to stay vigilant. Roger won't stop until he gets what he wants." Caleb nodded. "We'll be ready." That night, Caleb walked home feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. But as he turned onto his street, he noticed something strange. A group of men stood near his house, their faces obscured by shadows. Caleb froze, his pulse racing. The men noticed him and started walking toward him. "Hey, kid," one of them called, his voice low and menacing. "We need to have a word." Caleb's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. He turned and ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He darted through alleyways and side streets, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The men pursued him, their footsteps echoing in the night. Caleb's mind raced as he tried to think of where to go. He spotted a convenience store up ahead, its lights still on. He sprinted toward it and burst through the door, startling the cashier. "Call the police," Caleb gasped. "Someone's following me." The cashier grabbed the phone, dialing quickly. Caleb glanced back out the window and saw the men lingering across the street. One of them pointed at Caleb and then made a slashing motion across his throat before disappearing into the darkness. When the police arrived minutes later, the men were gone. Caleb gave them a description, but he knew it wouldn't lead to much. As he rode home in the back of a police car, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating fast. This wasn't just about the program anymore. It was personal. The next morning, Caleb woke up feeling like a storm was brewing. The threats were no longer subtle. The men who had followed him the previous night weren't just trying to intimidate him. They wanted to send a message. When Mrs. Montgomery picked him up later that day, Caleb told her everything. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she listened, her jaw set in determination. "This has gone too far," she said. "We're reporting this to Detective Harris immediately." At the police station, Caleb recounted the events of the previous night. Detective Harris listened carefully, jotting down notes. "I'll increase patrols around your neighborhood," Harris said. "But this is serious, Caleb. Whoever these people are, they're escalating. You need to be extra cautious." "I'm not quitting," Caleb said, his voice firm. "I didn't think you would," Harris replied. "But don't take unnecessary risks. Call us if anything seems off." Despite the threats, Caleb refused to let fear rule his life. He returned to the mentorship program with even greater determination, focusing on his sessions and helping Mrs. Montgomery rally the other teens. The program's reopening had reignited everyone's spirits, and the center was buzzing with energy. But the tension was never far away. One afternoon, as Caleb worked on a group project with Jasmine and Marcus, Mrs. Montgomery walked into the room, her face pale. "Caleb," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk." He followed her to her office, where Detective Harris was waiting. "What's going on?" Caleb asked, his heart sinking. Harris held up a photo. It showed Caleb walking home from the center, taken from a distance. "We found this in an envelope left on the front steps of the police station this morning," Harris said. "It was addressed to me, but it's clearly meant as a warning for you." Caleb's stomach turned. "What else was in the envelope?" "A note," Harris said, pulling out a piece of paper. It read, "You've been warned. Stay out of this." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not stopping. They can threaten me all they want, but I'm not giving up." Mrs. Montgomery placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Caleb. We'll face this together." Over the next few days, security at the center was tightened. Off-duty police officers patrolled the area, and Caleb was always accompanied by someone when he walked home. But the threats didn't stop. One evening, Mrs. Montgomery received a phone call. The voice on the other end was cold and calculated. "End the program, Evelyn," the caller said, "or you'll regret it." She hung up and immediately reported the call to Detective Harris. But the caller had used an untraceable number, leaving the police with little to go on. The threats began taking a toll on everyone. Some of the teens started skipping sessions out of fear, and even the staff seemed on edge. Caleb could feel the pressure mounting, but he refused to let it break him. "We can't let them win," he told Jasmine and Marcus one afternoon. "If we back down now, everything we've worked for will be for nothing." Jasmine nodded. "You're right. We just have to keep pushing forward." The tipping point came one Friday night. Caleb was at home with his grandma when they heard a loud crash outside. Rushing to the window, they saw flames engulfing Mrs. Montgomery's car, which was parked in front of the house. "Call 911, Caleb shouted, grabbing a bucket of water and running outside. Neighbors came out to help, and the fire department arrived within minutes. The flames were extinguished, but the car was completely destroyed. As the firefighters inspected the scene, one of them handed Caleb a small object. It was a charred piece of paper with the words, "This is your last warning," scrawled on it. Caleb's grandma pulled him into a tight hug, her voice trembling. "That's it, Caleb. This has to stop. I can't lose you." "You won't, Grandma," Caleb said, his own voice shaky but resolute. "But I'm not backing down. Not now." Mrs. Montgomery arrived soon after, her face a mix of anger and fear. "This is beyond anything I've ever dealt with," she said. "But we're not letting them scare us into giving up." The next day, Mrs. Montgomery called an emergency meeting at the center. Caleb, the other teens, and a handful of parents and staff gathered in the main room, the air thick with tension. "We're under attack," Mrs. Montgomery said, addressing the group. "But that's because what we're doing here matters. They wouldn't be trying so hard to stop us if they didn't see our potential." Caleb stood up, his voice strong despite the fear gnawing at him. "We've come too far to quit now. They can burn cars and make threats, but they can't take away what we've built here." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. As the meeting ended, Caleb felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he knew he wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever came next, and this time they wouldn't just defend themselves. They would fight back.